Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Tonight we honor Imam Ali alayhi salam, and there are so many different ways one could honor him, and I've just chosen to honor one particular aspect, and I kind of wanted to start with, in my opinion, one of his more interesting and more notable acts, one of which has been mentioned in the Quran in a verse that has been universally recognized to be attributed to him. And for those who aren't familiar with the story, a poor man, which is depicted right here, was in the mosque of the Prophet, and he was asking for somebody to give him some charity. And after a while, nobody had given him anything. And so eventually, Imam Ali alayhi salam, who was in the middle of ruku', extended out his hand such that the ring became available and indicated that he could take the ring. And according to a lot of hadith, this ring was actually a very important ring. Some hadiths talk about how it was actually the ring of Sulaiman. And this act of charity was recognized as such in the Quran, in the verse where it says, "Your guardian can only be Allah and His Messenger, and those who believe, who establish worship, and pay the poor due, and bow down." And so the idea is that these two are combined together, and both Sunni and Shia recognize this. But what's also notable is at the beginning is your guardian can only be Allah and His Messenger and those, so it's encompassed within this. And so I find it really interesting that this act of charity was so recognized. Not only was it recognized in the Quran, but it was linked to the Walayah of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. And I think what's also notable about this act of charity is such that we can learn a lot by how ready he was to give and the conditions by which he was able to do it. And so I kind of always thought about charity in terms of 3 different things have to be there in order for you to do it. One is that there has to be an awareness of the problem and awareness of the who you're ready to give to. You need to have the spiritual state of mind that you're ready to give, and then you have the means to have the means to do it. And we're going to talk about those 3 things and how some of those times those things aren't always present within us. And so I really want you guys to open your mind today and examine yourself critically and see if you really think you've met all these conditions, and whether you really are where we may think we are. Because I would argue that most of us would not be doing what Amir al-Mu'mineen was doing and giving a ring off somebody's finger in charity. I think most people would be, I'm praying, leave me alone. So I think that next level type of conduct is something we can learn a lot from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Quran says about the importance of charity and some interesting verses that I don't think are talked about enough. Some statistics about poverty, some causes of poverty to increase our awareness. And then I think more importantly, some of the barriers that we have to helping the poor. And then some other tips that I came across. So this was a really interesting sequence of about 12 verses that is in Surah 69. And what I find interesting about this set of verses is that it basically describes somebody who has been sent to hellfire or will be sent to hellfire, and he laments about what sent him to this place. So it's supposed to be a reminder to us about what we should avoid to be in this person's shoes. In order for us to really take home this message, we need to really imagine that we could really be this person. And if we can't, then we can't really get the full benefit of these set of verses here. And so what I find interesting is that within this verse, it talks a lot about giving to the poor. And what I find interesting particularly, and I'll let you guys read this on your own, but the 2 main reasons that are given as to why he's ended up in this situation was that he did not believe in Allah, and he did not encourage the feeding of the poor. Not even that he didn't feed the poor, but he didn't even encourage it. So that it's not even taking it to that next level. But to put that with this, to me is really powerful. And then what is talked about afterwards is that he has no friend here today, which we'll talk about why that's even more interesting later. And there's no food except scum. So we need to really take to heart the fact that if we don't help the poor, we may end up worse than those who are poor after the day of judgment. As to why, what benefit giving to the poor has, there are many verses in the Quran that talk about how we need to, we have these challenges so that we can be tried. And charity is one of those main aspects that it's going to do that. And then another really interesting verse is that it talks about how we have to spend out of what we love. So a lot of times when we give our leftovers or whatever else we don't have or don't want. But really true charity is giving the best things out. Just like in the example of Imam Ali alayhi salam, that ring was very valuable to him. And we need to remember this when we're giving, to not just give what we don't want. So there's a lot of statistics about poverty in the world and in the United States, but I think because we're living here in the United States, we need to be acclimated with the situation here. And I think, this is the area we're going to have the most impact. So the poverty statistics, the poverty liners are sort of a universal thing, in such that you can compare it across a lot of other nations. And as of recently, about 15% of people in the United States are under the poverty line, which is probably more than many people would think. And in terms of the poverty line, anyone who's making under $12,000 as an individual would consider that part in the poverty line. And you can imagine it be very difficult to live under those set of circumstances. And these statistics have been rising continuously over the past 10 or 15 years and have continued to rise. And inequality is only becoming more stark these days. In terms of poverty, homelessness is probably the biggest issue and the most notable. And over 500,000 people in this country have no place to go home to. And there's 20,000 in Nebraska, and there's 2,000 here just within our local area. I mean, we see them all the time. And perhaps most unfortunately, many of the homeless are children, and many of them also have mental illnesses, and many of them are extremely unfortunate for different reasons. And to add insult to injury, homelessness has actually become criminalized. Probably upwards of 25% of cities have done this, and many of them, probably over 50%, have added other restrictions, such that if you're standing on the street, you may just get flung around the city and you have no place to stay, which I find to be really hard. This is a really important slide, and I think for all of us to have awareness about what leads somebody to be homeless, because sometimes it's easy to just look at somebody who's homeless and imagine that they've always been that way, or that they're just some different type of person. But a lot of times, if you look around this room, or people around us could easily run into circumstances like these. So around 68% of homeless people have suffered from some sort of addiction. And you can imagine how crippling that would be in your own life. About 50% of women have actually experienced domestic violence or fleeing from domestic violence of some sort. About 20 to 25% of the homeless have a reported mental illness, and I would probably argue that there's probably a lot more out there that's not reported. With any fluctuation in the economy, job loss and underemployment, whenever there's a dip in the economy, homelessness is only going to increase. We saw that in 2008 with all the foreclosures going on. Sometimes people just can't make ends meet, and they have no support system to help them out. There are a lot of veterans who have post-traumatic stress disorder, and they come home and they're not really acclimated to this country, and so as a result they really get left behind. A lot of teenagers who have unfortunate circumstances like pregnancy, addiction, or other sorts of discrimination, have ended up on the street. And then perhaps most sad is that whenever people end up as a homeless person, there's a sense of despair that sort of takes over. And after you've lived that way for a few years, you start to lose hope that things will get better. And you eventually just kind of accept your circumstances and make the best of what you have. This chart here talks about, and something that I find very important to realize, is how mental health and poverty are connected. So for people with mental illnesses, including depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and different psychiatric disorders, they tend to have a much higher level of healthcare needs and needs of other sorts. And so as a result, their healthcare expenditures go up. Some employers are less off to deal with those. And as a result, they become more poor. But when they become more poor, they receive less of the things that they need. And so it's a vicious cycle where people who are mentally ill become more mentally ill and become homeless as a result. But perhaps most sad is that the people who are homeless and who are poor suffer from something called extreme loneliness, really. And for anyone who's accepted or experienced anything like that, it's arguably one of the worst feelings you can have. I mean, that's why in prison, solitary confinement is such that it is. And I found a really interesting quote by an ethnographer who basically experienced homelessness himself for 3.5 years just to study it and experience it. And he wrote, "Homelessness is the most lonely experience of my life. It is a constant gnawing hunger for acknowledgement, attention, love, and acceptance. This hunger is a deeper, darker shadow to the physical hunger that I experience daily. But as harsh as loneliness is, it is only the blunt periphery of the suffering. At a sharping, piercing center, I feel abandoned, betrayed, and forsaken." And I can only imagine what it would be like for someone who's not just doing this on a temporary basis, but to get looked at on the streets and to be treated like you're not even a real person, to have no family. This person right here was written about in an article that I found interesting, and I recommend you all to read it. And it's titled "Homelessness in San Francisco, the Lonely End to a Life of Unrealized Promise." And this is a lady who, for all in the world when she was younger, had all sorts of potential and had Ivy League aspirations, and for whatever reason fell into the wrong crowd and started using drugs. She eventually lost her leg. But perhaps most sad was that the way we all found out about her was that she was actually unidentified in a morgue for about 4 months, and nobody even knew that she had died. No family had known that she was gone. And the only way that they found out was that a reporter actually reached out to the family. And even after that, it took weeks to really get her identity all the way. And I can only imagine if you were to just die and imagine that nobody had even noticed for 4 months, how lonely your life really had been. So I want to talk a little bit about just barriers in general to helping the poor, why they're in this situation, and what are some reasons that with all the wealth that we have these days, things are still the way they are. So in America, we live in the American dream. So, I don't know about you guys, but I always hear about, my dad telling me how he came here with very little, and, he did all this stuff to reach the point where he's at. And, I would imagine most people in the room have a similar background, or at least know people like this who, they came with very little and they worked extremely hard and achieved great things. And so many would argue that, we don't really need to help the poor. The opportunities are here. You're just not taking advantage of them. So, we don't really understand what the issue is. You're just going to work harder. And that's basically what this guy said right here, was that poverty is essentially a choice. You can't help those who simply will not be helped. One problem that we've had, even in the best times, is people who are sleeping on the grates, the homeless who are who are homeless, you might say, by choice. So these people are not working hard enough. They prefer this lifestyle of hanging out on the streets. There's really not a whole lot we need to really do for them. And if you talk to the City Union Mission, they'll tell you, we don't give to these roadside panhandlers either. And in fact, it profiles right here on 72nd and Dodge. I mean, I'm sure many of you are driving by that just to get here today. You've all seen how many homeless people there are there all the time. And according to them, 9 times out of 10, these people are here to feed their addiction, right? And they're making about 60 to 70 bucks a day. Maybe when it's cold, they can make $400. And, we're conditioning these people to be on the streets. That's what many would say. So what does our religion say about this particular aspect? Do we just accept that? So there's actually a very interesting story that I think you all should really pay attention to here. And this is a story from Imam Sajjad alayhi salam when he was in Medina coming home from Friday prayers. And the Imam talked to his maid Sakina and said, "Feed every beggar who knocks on my door, for today is Friday." And Abu Hamza al-Tamali said, "But not everyone who begs is deserving." So this is the same question that has been asked that we just talked about. And what does the Imam reply? He says, "I fear that if I refrain from feeding a beggar who is deserving and turn him away, for what happened to Jacob and his family may happen to us, the Ahlul Bayt. Feed them, feed them." So what exactly happened to Jacob and his family? So Jacob was a pretty well-to-do individual, and every night he would slaughter a sheep, which you can imagine back in that day, if you could slaughter a sheep every night, you're probably well-to-do, and you probably have an excess of food. And so what he would do is he would call throughout the city to ask people to partake in this extras of the feast here. And it so happens that night a beggar named Nimal was begging to Jacob, and he said, "Feed the traveling, strange, ostensibly poor beggar with extra food." So he really humbles himself, and he's at the door, repeating this at the door, but Jacob and his family had ignored him, and they didn't really believe his words. And so this man became extremely sad and extremely hungry, and he had nowhere to go. So he basically slept starving and praying to God that he would help him. And so what ended up happening was that Allah had actually punished Jacob for this incident, and the actual punishment was through the trials of Yusuf alayhi salam. And you saw it took a long time for that. That was a long period of suffering for this incident. And so the main story here was that Jacob and them did not believe that his words were true, that he was really a needy person. And so Imam Ali alayhi salam has a quote, says, "Never turn away the beggar, even if he exceeds the limits." And so the policy of the Imam is not what's recommended by the City Union Mission or that of Ronald Reagan. But those would probably be the most common opinions you're going to find in the public. What about who isn't poverty really God's problem? I mean, there's a quote here from a recent article: "Is God to blame for our food crisis?" And there's an Indian actor, Kamal Hassan. I don't know who that is, but he recently made a quote on social media that says, "I don't need a God who doesn't feed a hungry child today, but promises you a heaven tomorrow." I mean, to me, this quote ignores the obvious inequality that humanity has caused for themselves. The fact that a third of our food is wasted, the fact that we have an adequate supply of food, is just not properly utilized, or the fact that human beings have their own purposes on this world to do that. But regardless of that, the Quran has already addressed this issue before, and this is not a new argument. So sometimes it's useful to realize when you see these kind of things, to know that the Quran oftentimes has a response to these things. And so these same questions were already brought to them, and the law has already rebuked those kind of issues. The other one of the other barriers that I think is probably one of the major barriers is what we call the bystander effect. And the bystander effect is essentially that if you have a group of people observing an incident, they're about 60% less likely to act on it. And so there have been many notable examples of the bystander effect, including like homicides and rapes that have happened in public where no one did anything to stop them because people assumed that somebody else was going to do it or that they shouldn't get involved. And I think with charity and poverty, the bystander effect is really in play because imagine a situation where you think that other people it's someone else's job to take care of it. It's the government's job. It's the rich people's job. And so you're just one of these people who's sitting there watching something happen, thinking that really it's being taken care of when it's not. And many studies have talked about how if you're with others, you're probably going to act about 20% of the time, as opposed to 80% of the time when you're alone. So we should think about the personal responsibility of poverty rather than as a group responsibility, I think. One other issue is, I don't know about you, but I get tons of charity emails all the time. When I'm watching TV, there's all sorts of commercials. I get inundated with all sorts of charity requests, right? And if you just type in the word donate to Google, you get about 785 million page views. I mean, at some point, it all becomes rather overwhelming and you become desensitized to just about all of it. And there's a lot of studies that talked about how if you have, the more choices you have, the less likely you are to actually make a decision. So a lot of studies have talked about how if you have a restaurant and you have, say, 50 items, the satisfaction in the the amount of people may order is actually less, just because of how overwhelmed they are by the decision. And people are actually happier when they have 5 to 10 items or something like that. And I think with charities, it's the same way. I mean, where does your money really need to go? I mean, so there's also this concept that, and a lot of studies have talked about how people tend to regret an action rather than an inaction. And so people become paralyzed by all these choices and they become inactive. And to them, that's easier than making the wrong decision. Oh, you fed this, you supplied this charity, you really should have done the other one. This one was a way more need. You messed that up. And I think the Quran talks about this term, the miskeen, as really kind of the destitute types. And there's a part of me that, as I'm driving in the street and I observe people who they act around the corners with homeless people, they sort of get this uncomfortable look that I don't really want to see you. I just want to pretend like we're not here. I just want the green light to hit so we don't have to see this anymore. And I think there's a part of me that thinks that in our own spiritual state we have it's very easy to not feel that compassion for the poor, to really feel that compassion for them, to rather just feel pity for them and just say, I don't want to really be a part of this problem anymore. And I think this is a major obstacle because I think it really at the fundamental level, it means we have a very hard heart if we look at a poor person and we want to look like that. And I think we need to, if we have that reaction, we need to really examine in ourselves critically. So with any charity, when you're giving something up, there's always a huge risk of financial loss, right? I mean, if you have an appeal to charity and you want to give thousands of dollars away, well, I mean, I have my own family to feed, I have my own bills, I have my own debts. And Allah has addressed this multiple times in the Quran. He says, who is he that will lend to Allah a goodly loan? I always find that interesting when I read that the Quran the first time. It says a goodly loan. It's not a loss, it's a loan. And I don't know about you, but whenever you get a loan, you want to get the You want to get the best terms for your loan. You want to get the best organization behind you. People talk about FDIC. Well, if you have a law as your creditor, I'm pretty sure that beats that. This is Apple stock starting in the 90s. It cost about $1 in 1992. Now it's worth about $400. If you can make an investment that would increase the yield about 400 times, would you take that investment? When Allah says He'll increase your loan manifold and give you paradise, He's not just giving you an increase in your return, He's giving you paradise in addition to that. So whenever we talk about financial loss, we need to think about what the Quran says. Do we really believe this statement? Do we really believe this statement when we're giving? The other thing is what I call the drop in the ocean mentality. So I could give all of my money away and still people are going to be poor tomorrow. I may be able to stop somebody from being poor for a year, but how long can I really offset that? So the Quran actually gives a great answer to this, and it's one of my favorite verses in the Quran. And it says, the likeness of those who spend their wealth in the way of Allah is as the likeness of a grain of corn. It grows 7 ears, and each ear has 100 grains. Allah gives manifold increase to whomever He wills, and Allah is sufficient for His creatures' needs, all-knowing. Do you imagine maybe just one seed of corn, after a while it can turn into a whole field of corn. But you never know which dollar can turn into that. And we shouldn't think little of the small contributions we can give out. We should always remember what the Quran says about how the acts of charity can grow. And it may not happen in this world, but maybe this corn is what you would see in the afterlife with that $1 you gave. Maybe that $1 made a huge impact on somebody's life. You never know. So to not diminish even just a small amount. I think there are some other spiritual barriers that we talk about, that you can talk about. If you have a lot of sins that you have in your life, you're probably unlikely to be very sensitive to the needs of others. You may not really feel that level of sensitivity when somebody asks you for something. And I wouldn't be kidding if there's a level of arrogance that we have if somebody asks us for money or money is appeal. I think a lot of us have the mentality that we've earned all the money that we have. So it's really unfair for me to have sat here, worked all day, all night for this money and then just give it away to you. But I think the Quran talks about how the money is not really belongs to us, but it's really something that has been provided to us by Allah. And I think the other illusion is that wealth is really because of us. That everything that we've done is a direct extension of our own earnings. But I think it's more appropriate that it's a correlation. We see all the time people who work very hard and get no money, people who work almost little to nothing and get tons of money. And there's so many circumstances that determine whether you make money or who gets money, where you were born. How much of that is really because of us? Isn't that really arrogant of us to just assume that? I think Allah has said that in this verse, that He wants us to come back to that understanding. So I want to kind of just close right now by giving some tips that I think would be helpful, some kind of take-home messages. So I think if we're going to give charity and really have that compassion for the poor that we need to have, that the Quran has said that we really need to have, we need to show mercy to receive mercy. And I think if we really examine ourselves, we have a lot that we need to have forgiven in our lives. We rely on the mercy of Allah. And I think it would be foolish of us to just assume that we shouldn't have to show mercy to anybody else. We can just get all the mercy and not have to show that to anybody else. So a lot of poor people have made bad decisions. I mean, let's just be honest. Probably decisions that maybe me and you wouldn't make. But just because they made those decisions doesn't mean that you can't help them. Doesn't mean that you can't want to donate in their way. So I think if we remember our own shortcomings, we're more apt to help others. And just like a famous quote from in the Bible says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." You know, if we're the people who are deserving of mercy, maybe we should also pass it along to others. So another tip is to give before you're asked, because a lot of it's going to really affect your intentions about what is going on. So there's a quote from Imam Ali alayhi salam which says, "If you help a deserving person without his request, then it is generosity. But if you're doing after request, it's really just because of shyness and fear of reproach." And I think a lot of us can identify with this. If somebody asks you for charity or they need it, it's really more out of guilt that you're giving it than anything else. You're really kind of depriving yourself of that real blessing of giving out charity. And in my opinion, you're doing less good, because it's better to give before it's needed than after it's needed. So it's like if you have a heart attack, it's better to prevent the heart attack than to treat the heart attack. And one outcome tend to be way better than the other. I think a lot of us have concerns about giving to the poor because of drugs, because of the fact that they may misuse these resources, that they're not really deserving. And I think there are ways you can give and also protect yourself from that concern. I think a lot of times we're encountering poor people when we're driving. So I think if you can hold some of these things in your car and you pass by things, you're not going to be so apt to just look the other way at somebody who is begging. You may actually have something positive to give them. So if you have maybe some granola bars, some snacks, some water bottles, if you're worried about them misusing cash, you can have gift cards to places that you feel like they wouldn't misuse them. You can carry certain extra areas of clothing, bus passes, because they get around that way. But I think more than anything, just showing a little bit of humanity is not a bad idea if you have nothing to give. There's hadith that says that smile is charity. Maybe instead of just giving them a nasty look or looking the other way, we give them a smile, say hello, ask them how their day was, give them a kind word, maybe a motivational word, maybe even send them a prayer or something. There's maybe something else we can give beyond just a material possessions. And I would argue that they need this more than anything else, that despair and loss of hope have really creeped into a lot of this population, and it can really change your life. There's a lot of stories about people who have been homeless and they experience small acts of charity, and it makes their week, it makes their month, because they're so lonely and so alone that any sort of humanity is really a breath of fresh air for them. So we have to give also, the Quran advises us to be moderate in giving. We don't want to give so much that we're going to need to be given to. And so the Quran extols us to not give excessively or sparingly. I would argue we tend to be more on the sparingly side naturally as human beings. So, but we should never put ourselves into poverty to help poverty. I think an underrated aspect is public policy. There's only so much you're going to be able to do at an individual level, and the government is going to have the biggest impact on different areas of poverty. And so if somebody's really interested in helping the poor at a bigger level than that, there are all sorts of programs that have actually shown to be really helpful for the poor and homeless, including ones that really help to rehabilitate them, help children who are in poverty to get educational support so they can actually build a future for themselves, supportive housing so that people aren't living on the streets and they have to make payments, but they're reasonable payments until they can get their feet back up. And so these are all things that, if you're voting, especially in your local elections or things like that, you can actually make a big impact, probably a bigger impact than any donation you make, if you pay attention to some of these policies and actually vote for them if you really wanted to. And the last tip that I have, and this is kind of the last point that I have here, is don't look too far away for giving charity. If you actually look at the Quran, it actually includes parents and close relatives as a source of charity. So for those of you who have family members who are having rough times, helping them out, giving them a loan, or even just giving things for them is an act of charity in the Quran's eyes. But I think overall, I think we need to look at our community first. And as I look at our community, we have a lot of people that are actually probably at risk that people don't know. I mean, how many people in this room are refugees and came here, have no family here? How many people here have very low income jobs? I've talked to many people here who are living on very low means. How many of us are asking those around us, even the people we don't know very well, how are you doing? Keeping in touch with them if they haven't come here. Are we following up with these people and making sure that we're not dropping the ball on anybody here? Because poverty really is when the fabric of society is destroyed, people fall through the cracks, such that somebody could go missing for 4 months and not be noticed. Imagine if in our community there's people who are living on the streets or close to that point. Have we really thought about that? Maybe think about somebody that you haven't reached out to in this community that maybe having a hard time. Just reach out to them, see how they're doing. Maybe there's some sort of support. Be there for them. I mean, when things are hard, don't just shy away. But let's deal with those problems as they come out before poverty and homelessness happens. Because I think we tend to think homelessness is for other people, but it happens. And it wouldn't surprise me if somebody in this room has been homeless at some point, whether in this country or in a different country. So I think we really need to pay attention to that and take care of our own community first. Make sure that we're taking care of those even that we don't know about. So ask. And that's all I have. Salam Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.